Welcome to ECA's fourth Coronavirus Impact Webinar. Today's experts are ECA Director of Employment and Skills Andrew Eldred and Liz Bridge of the Construction Industry Joint Taxation Committee. Andrew and Liz will be discussing the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, notably the arrangements regarding furlough, as well as covering other related topics. I'll also be able to take your questions afterwards, so please do send them in using the chat. All of ECA's coronavirus guidance can be found at www.eca.co.uk/coronavirus. ECA was also a signatory to a letter to the Prime Minister yesterday about support for the industry, and more details of that can be found on our website. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everybody. As Mike says, we're dedicating this session to employment and specifically to the job retention scheme and furlough. But before I get on to that, though, just to highlight, like Mike, that it's always worth looking at the coronavirus webpage, the ECA Coronavirus webpage. There's always good stuff on that. And a couple of things that to be aware of that's either on there now or will soon be, because as you know, this is all moving very fast. Number one, the Construction Leadership Council have now issued version 2 of the site operating procedures. You know, those are the sort of procedures that sites need to follow if they're to justify continue to operate in the current circumstances. And of particular interest, I think, is clarification in version 2 of the site operating procedures that where it is not possible or safe for workers to distance themselves from each other by 2 meters, work should not be carried out. Secondly, ECA has been active in this area. My colleague Rob Driscoll in particular, and if you go onto the coronavirus webpage, you'll see 2 new sort of template letters which might be useful to you. The first of those is a letter to a client, a customer, setting out the precautions that you are taking to ensure that you and your people can work safely whilst on their site, whilst on their premises. So that provides assurance for that work which you want to continue doing. The second is a much longer letter, which is a letter that you can send to a main contractor seeking assurance that their site does meet the site operating procedure requirements, and clearly that's to assist you in circumstances where you've got some doubts about that. So turning now to today's topic, I mean, the situation we're in today, Thursday, compared to we were last time I talked about this on Friday, is a happier situation, and I think we've got greater clarity. On the basis of that clarity, ECA has issued guidance, which again is on the coronavirus webpage. It's called Furlough, detailed guidance in the employment relations section. And I guess probably quite a few of you may have read that already. And I mean, the purpose of today is to really reinforce that, to reinforce your reading of that. Of course, if you haven't read it, then hopefully this will be of even greater value. What's certainly of value is we've got a proper expert online to assist, and that's Liz Bridge. Many of you will know Liz, long-standing involvement with the industry and specifically the Joint Taxation Committee. She's there really because of her tax expertise, which really is unrivaled, particularly in construction. And she's going to talk a little bit about the position of directors, because I know last time that I was speaking, that was a question which a lot of you were asking, and I think signally failed to give a convincing response. So Liz's sort of input on that will be very valuable. Secondly, there are other aspects to do with how you manage the claims process, the interaction with revenue and customs, and towards the end of the presentation, Liz will be talking about that. At the very end, there'll be a question and answer session. Do fire as many questions as you can, whether on tax, whether on furlough, or any related matters. We are planning for next week to pick up on some of these questions, some of the additional questions that we might not have covered so far in the webinars, including this one. So do fire as many questions as you want during the course of the webinar. I mean, this is a little bit of a revision, but I thought it's helpful to provide a sort of a definition of furlough, because it kind of puts everything else that we're going to say in context, because the government has a very clear idea of what furlough is, and by extension, therefore, what furlough isn't, and that lies at the heart of maybe some of the areas that we're going to talk about later in terms of, you know, from some people's perceptions, a lack of flexibility in some areas of furlough. I mean, the first point to make is operates through the PAYE system, and Liz no doubt will talk about the mechanics of that. But that's the chosen vessel, that's the chosen mechanism for this to operate. It applies to people who otherwise would have been made redundant or temporarily laid off because of the current emergency. And of course, here's one of the crunch issues. It's people are asked to stop working, and of course that then leads on to the debate, which is still going on, as to whether the scheme can be extended to those working reduced hours, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the course of today. But I can tell you up front, I was on a CBI webinar earlier today, and they're still in the position where they are arguing for this additional flexibility, but are still getting pushback from the government. Finally, of course, this element is people aren't working, but they are still on the payroll. They are still employed, and that raises issues around continuation of employment rights and entitlements. And one of the ones that's coming through a lot in terms of questions that we're receiving is in the area of holiday entitlement, particularly with the bank holidays coming up shortly. And I'll have a bit to say about that, albeit we still don't have clarity from the government on that question. Okay, just a little sort of, refresh in terms of where we've been. I mean, it's difficult to believe, but we're only less than 2 weeks since the Chancellor actually announced furlough. He announced it on the Friday, the 20th of March. Our first sort of discussion of furlough was on the 24th of March webinar, and I made the point at the time, there's a lot of information and claims flying around about what furlough was and what furlough wasn't. The reality was we knew very little. The government late, rather sneakily, I would suggest, late on Thursday the 26th, did finally push out some detailed guidance, and we talked about a bit about that in the webinar on Friday the 27th of March. There were some areas that clarified. Specifically, the good news was that employer national insurance and auto enrolment pension contributions were covered and could, on top of the 2,500. There was, though, still a lack of clarity around what the 80% was. 80% of what? By the afternoon after our webinar, the government had issued revisions, again without really declaring the fact, and actually the guidance became a lot clearer on what the 80% was of. So we're now in a position today to speak with greater confidence about what the 80% covers and what it doesn't cover. So there's the structure. I mean, the structure we've adopted for the presentation today is identical really to the structure that's adopted in the guidance, covering who can claim, employees you can claim for, work out what you can claim and what you'll need to make a claim. Obviously, in the course of the presentation, I and then Liz will expand and explain on that above and beyond what the government guidance itself says. So hopefully we'll add some value that way. Who can claim? I won't spend a lot of time on this. Two things I would point out, though. Recruitment agencies can claim, and effectively what that means, and although the language is a little bit ambiguous at times, I'm pretty confident that agency workers, provided they're paid through PAYE, can be claimed for. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Administrators is another sort of new addition to the list of people who can claim. Obviously, that's for companies that are in administration, which regrettably could be a situation that we find ourselves in our industry and elsewhere. Employees you can claim for. Well, again, the guidance, the government guidance basically says any kind of employee can be claimed for, including those with various forms of short-term or flexible contracts, and also the point I've already made about agency workers. There's a long list of specific cases that the guidance covers, and I can't go through all of them today, but the ones I would highlight, I mean, the first sub-bullet point there, really that's dealing with trying to sort of backtrack on some of the early responses that employers made to the emergency when it started, before we knew about the furlough regime and before the government announced it. So it is possible for you, if you previously made people redundant off the back of the emergency, it is possible for you to rehire them and put them on furlough, provided that the redundancy occurred since the 28th of February. And the same cut-off date applies to people that you may have put on leave, unpaid leave in particular. They can be transferred onto furlough on the basis that if it occurred after the 28th of February, then they're deemed to have been put on those things because of the emergency. Those who are on sick leave or self-isolating, they stay on that, and they stay on the sick pay that's relevant there until their period of sickness is over. You are then at liberty to put them on furlough if you don't need them to come back to work, or you can't provide them with work. Those who are shielding, they can be put on furlough straight away. And so that's a slight difference from those on sick leave and self-isolating. But those people who are on shielding because they're in a vulnerable group, they can be furloughed under the furlough arrangement straight away. Questions around volunteering. Last time, and some of this relates, of course, to the question around do people who are doing some work for you, and the fact that there is a bar on that. One question that was asked was, well, what if my employees do it and we do it for free from some of my customers? I mean, the test that the guidance sets out is you really can't perform any work if it's for or on behalf of your existing employer. Now, that could include providing a service. It doesn't have to be a remunerated service. So, strictly speaking, volunteering isn't necessarily going to get you round that. I mean, there is pragmatically a question about how that could be monitored and enforced, but that is the principle as set out in the guidance. With regard to training, yes, employees can undergo training whilst they're on furlough. I guess particularly relevant to apprentices, because those of you who have apprentices, you might have been contacted by your training provider, your college. You almost certainly would have been if you're a JTL customer. Certainly JTL and others are now laying on a lot more online training, and I believe JTL will be also laying on online contact with tutors for those apprentices who are based out of a JTL owned and run training centre. So employees can undergo training whilst on furlough. A lot of it's going to be online, of course, because face-to-face training is more or less become impossible. But the sting in the tail on that is that when people are undergoing training during furlough, they do, as a minimum, need to receive the relevant national living wage or national minimum wage payment on top of the furlough payment. This is an employment. The next slide really is who else might count as an employee. Probably this one is more relevant to you if you have a significant agency workforce, and of course that tends to be the larger companies rather than the smaller ones. But it's just reiterating the point that I've made before, which is that the guidance is written very much from the perspective of HM Revenue and Customs. And those of you familiar with tax will know that the word employee in a tax national insurance context has a much broader definition than it does for an employment rights context. So really what they're interested in is people who are being paid through a PAYE payroll. So what that means in an agency context is that this scheme does not cover, for example, people working through an agency who are on CIS. It only partially covers those who are working through their own personal service company, and Liz will talk about limited companies in a sec. But it does cover agency workers who are on a PAYE contract, whether they're as an employee of the agency, which some agencies do operate, or as on a temporary workers contract, a PAYE contract for services. It also applies to individuals working through on PAYE through an umbrella company. Now, of course, the reality of the situation is our agencies and umbrella companies going to carry on paying people who aren't working for the next few weeks before they can actually claim, start getting the money back from the Revenue and Customs. And I suspect they'll be coming to their customers, yourselves, asking that question. But it is there as a possibility. As we're sort of talking about the area of employment status, the next slide, really, I'll hand over to Liz, who's going to talk about company directors, which I know, as I've said before, that's a big issue for many of you.
Hello, everybody. I think the problem with company directors is that the furlough scheme is based on claiming a grant for people who are not working. And when the government says not working, it means not working. Most company directors are working all hours the Lord sent to try and bring home stock, vans, see what's happening to existing projects, talking to workers, talking to people who owe them money, talking to banks. So most company directors are working. If you are going to claim furlough for a company director, you must show that you have written to them and told them that you intend to furlough them, and you must be able, in some senses, to be able to demonstrate that they didn't work. Now, that may be by putting their duties onto another director. It may be that they didn't do very much in a normal year, but it's worth thinking about that you can't go on working for free. The Revenue, for example, will have records of conversations with people about the payment of taxes. Those conversations are work conversations. If your company directors claim to be not working and are having those conversations, it would be absolutely evidence in the Revenue's hands that they were working. What I am trying to tell you is that I think that of all the claims you make, claims for furloughed company directors will be the most difficult to substantiate. The claim itself, if you have a non-working director, will only be for salary. It will not be for dividends. And it isn't clear yet, but I doubt it will be for benefits either. It will be for salary, money payments. And that you must be aware that the schemes that people have had where they pay themselves minimum salary and remunerate themselves in terms of dividends are schemes that in this situation we could not have foreseen it, but will come home to bite people. And I think that's all I've got to say. I'll pick up what turns up in the questions at the end, and we'll see what happens then. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I mean, you'll see on the slide, which I'm actually going to put back, the quote at the bottom of that slide, that company director's slide, is a direct quote from IPSI, who are the organisation for self-employed people, and you'll see from that they lobbied very heavily for dividends to be taken into account for the purposes of the scheme, but they're admitting there that they failed. That's and Liz has confirmed that as a director, it's only the PAYE element, the salary element, that will be taken into account for the purposes of the scheme. Quite apart from, as Liz says, the practical difficulties of demonstrating that you're not actually working. Okay. As I said at the beginning, part of furlough is that the employment relationship continues. You are entitled, it's your decision whether you furlough people and whom you furlough. But there is the requirement that the employees concerned must agree to it, and also part and parcel of that is the obligation not to discriminate. So we're not talking here about undergoing a sort of quasi-redundancy process with the full kind of criteria and so on that you have to justify your decisions. It's nothing like that. It's just a heads up that you should be careful not to discriminate under one of the protected grounds when choosing whom to furlough and whom to keep working, because there is a potential a deficit in terms of pay. So somebody could argue notionally that they have suffered a detriment by virtue of discrimination because they've been put on furlough. You do need to provide a written record of agreement. That's a requirement set out in the government guidance, and you'll see in the ECA furlough guide, which, as I've mentioned already, is on the ECA Coronavirus webpage. You will see a template letter recording an agreement on furlough, which you can adapt to your own purposes. Final bullet point: continuation of employment rights during the period of furlough. So your continuity of employment, your holiday accrual, and so on continues. The issue of holiday, taking holiday, and holiday pay it's emerged in the last few days as the hot topic. I guess now that people have got their heads around furlough, if you like, the primary issues, the primary questions, we're now moving on to the secondary questions, and the fact we've got the Easter holidays coming up, of course, is focusing people's minds. I've seen various bits of advice and heard various bits of advice on this, and I'll sort of kind of return to the language I was using a week or so ago about people pontificating about what furlough was at the time before the 26th of March when we got the definitive guidance. If somebody tells you with any degree of certainty about the interrelationship between holiday rights and furlough at the moment and profess to know, then I'm sorry, they're lying or they're mistaken, because at the moment nobody fully knows, and there's lots of debate going on amongst lawyers, including some very expensive lawyers, disagreeing about what the answer is. We have been pushing through the Construction Leadership Council up to BASE, the business department, for some days now for clarification on this, and I think they've been getting it as well from the likes of the CBI and others. Because, of course, what we're dealing with at the moment is a guide that's written by HM Revenue and Customs and the Treasury. And for the reasons I've already described, they're thinking purely in terms of how the PAYE system operates. They've given no thought whatsoever, or very little thought, to the issue of the interaction with various employment rights, and certainly with regard to holidays. I was on a webinar yesterday hosted by the HMRC. They were asked questions about holiday pay and holidays and weren't answering them. So where we're at now is we're now being told that BEIS are going to come out with guidance shortly, and unless and until we get that guidance, the answer to all these questions is we don't know. However, we do appreciate that you have got issues to do with people on furlough at the moment and a holiday coming up. And so we will be issuing an updated furlough guide on Monday of next week with some FAQs on this area. I mean, what I can tell you for the purposes of today's webinar is we believe that the best advice out there at the moment is that, yes, employees can take leave during furlough, and you can require your employees to take leave during furlough. There is a question as to what the payment is, whether it's the holiday, if like the holiday days that are taken at the same time as furlough, whether the right payment is the 80% under the furlough scheme, or the separate holiday pay calculation. And of course, the holiday pay calculation isn't necessarily based on exactly the same starting point as the furlough calculation. We will spell out a suggested approach to that in the guidance, but just to say, it is not clear at the moment what the right answer is, and you probably have to take a punt on what approach you want to take, and then correct it one way or the other, depending on what the guidance from the BEIS department is. Not a terribly satisfactory situation, but I didn't want to mislead you into believing that the clear answer. But we will be providing, through updated furlough leave guidance by Monday, a clear steer on the points of: can employees take leave during furlough? Can we require them to take leave during furlough? And some guidance on, if you like, some of the least worst options when it comes to setting the right holiday pay. Okay. Of course, the next slide deals with, as I've already said, one of the sort of fundamental issues that our members have been raising about furlough, and across the whole economy, this is an issue. I mean, the reality is we always have to bear in mind that within 2 weeks, the government have sort of intervened in a massive way in terms of supporting business and employees when it comes to wages. So at the very least, you could say 2.5 cheers for furlough. But this area is the area which is causing, as I said, the most sort of heartache at the moment. I have to say, they were pretty clear up front, and that definition that I gave you, that general definition I gave you earlier, the sort of initial definition, was pretty clear. It's for people who aren't performing work. The new clarification, the new detail that emerged at the end of last week is even more definitive. It says you cannot perform work, and performing work includes providing a service for or on behalf of your employer, or generating revenue for or on behalf of your employer. So, I mean, what the guidance says at the moment is if you perform any work, and the quote is there, then really that's got to be a matter which the employer and the employee have got to discuss. The risk, the cost really falls onto the employer, and really what we're looking here at, if the employer is not prepared to pay for a full week for only a partial week's work, or if they can't get their customers to pay for that, then the potential for a reduced hours arrangement. I'm going to talk a little bit later about rotating people between furlough and work, and that does seem to be a flexibility that is now available. But in terms of dealing specifically with individuals that you want to do a small amount of work during the course of a day, the government is really pointing you towards some kind of reduced hours arrangement. We've already got some advice on reducing hours on the coronavirus webpage. It's a guide called Managing Disruption. We're actually updating that at the moment, and that will certainly, the updated version, which is actually going to be called Alternatives to Furlough, that will be available on Monday. But for the time being, if you wanted to look at a reduced hours arrangement, that's in the existing Managing Disruption guide, which also includes some model letters in terms of an agreement to reduce hours. So where does that leave us? And of course, obviously in our industry, there are lots of people providing sort of emergency cover, essential cover. I know this is a particular issue for those of you involved in the fire, emergency and security sector, but to be honest, it's something that it applies more broadly across the electrical and mechanical world. Again, I'm just replicating in this slide some suggestions, some options that we also float in the guidance note, in the furlough guidance note that's on the web page that I've already told you about. So yeah, there is an option of full pay, but who's going to pay? Reduced hours and pay, reach an agreement on that. I say here, provided the employee relations obstacles can be overcome. I mean, clearly there is an issue there. If you've got some people who are at home not doing any work, getting 80% pay up to £2.5 grand, it's going to be difficult to agree something else with some of your employees to work some of the time that's less generous than that. But it may be that you're able to agree something that can work, but there is that employee relations angle to consider. Should you withdraw the service or downgrade the service? That's probably a commercial issue in terms of whether you're able to do that without commercial implications, commercial repercussions. A question for Rob Driscoll and his colleagues. What we are finding is quite a lot of you, as owners and directors of businesses, you're doing the work yourself. Not least because, as Liz says, it's probably going to be difficult for you to argue much in the way of government support if you furlough yourselves. So the company directors, company owners are kind of doing the work themselves. Obviously, if your company is relatively small, there's a probably greater scope from that than if your company is larger. But then if your company is larger, maybe you can actually put some of your people on work more or less full time. The other option, and this was an option that I conjured up really off the top of my head when asked it last time around, is you could subcontract. I know it sounds bizarre that you've got your workforce on furlough, but you subcontract to a third party to perform work on your behalf. But the reality is the rules under the self-employment income support scheme that the government have announced are more flexible when it comes to the self-employed working whilst still being able to claim a grant under that scheme. So you could subcontract. And again, that is something I'm aware of some companies doing. Coming to the question that I flagged up earlier, obviously this was a question that got asked initially when furlough was announced. Can we rotate people? At that time, it was difficult really to answer because there was no definition of any kind of minimum length of time for furlough. That's now been corrected because the detailed guidance that came out last week has definitively said the minimum period for furlough is 3 weeks. Now, it doesn't definitively say that you can then move to a system whereby you rotate people 3 weeks on furlough and 3 weeks at work or something similar. However, in terms of the weight of opinion on this, I would say it's moving pretty solidly to the view that you can. Now, those of you who were on the webinar last week will know that I reported that I'd been listening in to a CBI webinar earlier that day, and a Treasury official who'd been involved in drafting the detailed guidance had said, yes, you can rotate. What we've got now is something I think I would say even more official, which is that the CLC, the Construction Leadership Council, which is attached to the industry department, the business department that I mentioned earlier, they have now definitively come out with their own guidance and put forward rotation as an option. So although we haven't had it from Revenue and Customs yet, and we're still chasing for that, I think the weight of opinion both amongst the lawyers and indeed from the Construction Leadership Council, which in turn has run this guidance past the business department, is that you can rotate people. And if you think about the objectives, of the furlough scheme, you can see that there is a rationale for it. This is a mechanism for preserving employment, minimizing the level of disruption to society and the economy, and rotating people sort of 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, or a more complicated pattern, if you can think of one, or need one, that kind of makes sense in terms of sharing the pain and the gain between different groups in the workforce. So with the proviso, with the health warning that we haven't yet officially had the authors of the guidance modifying the guidance to say, yes, you can rotate. All the indications are that you can rotate. Industrial relations stuff, specifically of relevance to you if you're a JIB member company. I know many of you are, but also if you are also operating other agreements like the BISA agreement, the NIKI and so on. We're in a situation now where, I mean, from the 24th of March, the JIB has made clear that there is no barrier to JIB companies and their employees agreeing furlough arrangements in line with the government scheme. We're going to keep an eye on it, but for the next 12 weeks, it's open. And of course, the government are going to have to review their own views on the continuation of the furlough scheme beyond May very soon. So that's continuing. I say on the slide, and the slide I produced over the weekend, likely that some other engineering services agreements may follow suit. Well, now both the NACI and the BISA agreements have agreed similar deals to the JIB, and so they are all giving advice to their member firms around applying furlough. We're trying to keep aligned with each other in terms of the detail around that, and hopefully there aren't going to be inconsistencies, but I suppose the fundamental issue is if you're operating across more than one agreement, there isn't a disparity in terms of whether to furlough or not to furlough. All the agreements, I have to say, I don't know about plumbing. Information about plumbing is very difficult to get by. If any of you are involved with the plumbing JIB and know what's going on, please put a bit of information on the chat because I'd be very grateful to find out. Civil and building agreement, CIJC, I don't think anything's happening there, but that's probably less relevant for our purposes. Okay. Then this is the fundamental point, and I'll spend a bit of time on this. But as I said before, when I was talking last Friday, we'd had a few hours to try and digest the guidance that had been issued on Thursday evening, and it was a bit muddled. It wasn't very well drafted. What we've got now is a much clearer draft, and that was modified by a second version that appeared on Friday afternoon. As I've already said, there has been clarification about employer NICs and pension. Those are payable on top of the £2,500 cap and can be claimed as part of the grant. And there are basically two approaches. Approach number one is kind of helps us understand approach number two. Number one is literally for those people, and I'm one of them, who's on a fixed salary. So month in, month out, regardless of how hard I work, when I work, and everything else, I get paid the same. So in those circumstances, basically the system is the 80% of the salary, or 2,500 per month, whichever is the lower, plus the NICs and the minimum employer pension contributions. Any fees, commission, or bonuses excluded. So some of those sort of potential variable elements that some salaried staff get are taken out of that calculation. So this really applies to your classic white collar people, staff people, professional people who are on a fixed salary. In turn, what that basically means, we believe, we think it's pretty clear now in the guidance, that approach number 2 is everybody else. And we would say that includes most hourly paid people who've got a variable element to their pay, not because of anything to do with bonuses or anything like that, but the fact that their pay may vary depending upon overtime. There are periods when they work more overtime, periods when they work less overtime. And there you've got 3 different approaches based on an average or a comparable month. And the 3 different approaches are based really on how long somebody has spent actually in the workplace, so in terms of the duration of their employment. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Penultimate bullet point there, guide so far silent on any fees, commissions and bonuses for this category of employee. The weight of opinion is that any fees, commissions and bonuses for this group of employees, just like the salaried, should be excluded. As I said, the guidance note at the moment is silent on that, but the weight of opinion seems to be that you likewise, as with the salary, you don't include fees, commission or bonuses. I guess bonuses are probably the most likely additional payment that people like this could be getting. That gets excluded for the purposes of this calculation. I mean, clearly, certainly for people like electricians and so on, who are working quite significant amounts of overtime, the fact that the number 2 approach is based on an average earnings rather than an employment law holiday pay kind of normal earnings, basic earnings kind of calculation, does actually expand the potential to get up to the 2.5 grand as your 80%. But there's an averaging process that goes on as described in those 3 different methods of calculation. But it does boost those earnings potentially, and of course you can claim that back from the government. Final point for me before I hand back to Liz, to top up or not to top up. Rishi Sunak was very clear on this when he first announced this back on 20th of March, and all the guidance issued since, including the detailed guidance issued last week, is very clear on this. It is entirely optional. It is for the employer to decide whether they do so or not. If they do so, then they can't claim that back from the Revenue and Customs, and they can't claim back any additional associated costs, such as the NICs, such as the pension contributions that are tied to that top-up amount. So really, it's a decision for you. I mean, I have to say that the general view from across the industry is that employers are being cautious and, generally speaking, not volunteering to operate top-up. There is, of course, the potential negative response if you've got a split workforce between those who are still working and those who are furloughed. It might be less of an issue, of course, if you start rotating people, but if you've got 2 different sets of people, some working, some not working on the same rate of pay, that might cause some issue. There's also a financial sustainability angle, of course, on this. None of us at the moment know how long this current situation is going to last. So what we do in the template letter that's included in the furlough guidance, again, which you can get from the coronavirus webpage on the ECA website. In our detailed furlough guidance, the template letter there does give you the option as an employer to say you're going to top up, but also makes it very clear that you reserve the right to reduce that or to withdraw it completely in future. Okay, that's me. I'm going to hand back now to Liz to really deal with the sort of subsequent questions. So I've dealt with who's covered, both in terms of what kinds of employers are covered, what kinds of employees covered, and what you can claim. And I'm going to hand over to Liz to cover some of the mechanics of making a claim, to the extent we know what those mechanics are.
Hello. I'd like to just stress something, because I've been reading the questions as they come in. And it's important to remember that what we've been looking at and talking about is a grant scheme where the government will make you a grant. It will not, and it isn't telling you what you can pay. It is indicating what it will refund to you when it makes you a refund, what it will need to know, and the maximum money you will be able to claim. You can be more generous. You probably can't be less generous. It is extremely unlikely that anybody would ever give you a grant for workers where you hadn't paid them. You pay them 50, you think you can claim a grant of 80. No. But the thing that you must bear in your mind is you're in charge of your workers and the payment to your workforce. This is a grant scheme. It shows you what money you'll get back from the government. You will be expected to make a claim. There is no indication yet of the forms, the online site, the questions. But what we do know that you'll need to know, and that, if you have a quiet hour you would put together, is your pay-as-you-earn reference number, the number of employees being furloughed. I think it would be wise to have the letters that went out to employees asking them if they wish to be furloughed and their responses. The dates that each furlough began and ended, especially if you're going to try anything like a rotation of 3 weeks. The amount that you're claiming. So you'll need to know the average wage and the 80% of the average wage. It's a simple calculation. It's a claim that you'll be putting in. You'll need your bank account number and your sort code, your contact name and your phone number. And as with any Inland Revenue scheme, they retain the right to retrospectively audit all aspects of your claim. This is going to be pretty chaotic, but the clearer, the better you can keep your paperwork and your figures now, the quicker you'll be able to make that claim and get that claim processed. So, and we are told that the claiming site will be available as at the end of April. Let's see what else we've got. So, end of April for the claim. You will be able to submit one claim at least every 3 weeks. I would have thought that probably people will be doing it monthly, because in my opinion and experience, we're not used to a paperwork run every 3 weeks. All claims can be backdated till the 1st of March. You'll need your letters offering furlough, accepting furlough to show a start date. Once the revenue has received your claim, you'll be eligible for a grant. You should make your claim in accordance with actual payroll amounts at the point at which you run your payroll, or in advance of an imminent payroll. I think that really answers a question I did see earlier on. Can I pay my workforce £1, owe them £1, claim the grant, and then pay them back? The answer is no. This is a grant scheme for money you have paid. And that, well, until I see otherwise, my experience of the revenue is that they only run grant schemes for money actually paid. They don't grant you stuff where you've promised to pay other people. So they would want to know that these were the figures that were running out in your payroll and that the money had left your bank. So you're going to look at what the grant scheme will basically run on figures of actual payments. I think we got another slide. Right. Wages of furloughed employees are subject to the usual pay-as-you-earn and national insurance. So although they're furloughed, that you've asked them, they've agreed, actually these are wages you're paying out, and you will run your software absolutely as normal. When you get these grants will be taxable profits, just as your wages are employment costs. So you will pay tax on the incoming money and you will deduct employment costs. Once your head is round it, I think it becomes simpler. You are an employer. You decide what you are going to pay people through this period. This scheme simply tells you what grant the revenue are prepared to make you as some recompense for what you have contracted to pay your workers. The grant will be taxable, the wages will be tax deductible. And I think that's where I've come to an end and where we really ought to look through our questions. I'll hand over to Andrew because he knows how to manipulate the questions down the page, I hope.
Thank you, Liz. I'm going to hand over to Mike because I have no capability whatsoever to handle the questions other than to try to answer some of them. So I'll hand over to Mike now.
Great, thanks both. That was really helpful. We've had quite a few questions, so we'll do our best to get through them and we'll run over if we can to try and cover as many as possible. Andrew, just quickly, one from me. You mentioned the national living wage and national minimum wage earlier. Have there been any changes to those this month?
Actually, yes, the new rates take effect this month. I mean, I'd love to say that we'd issued confirmation of that through the source, but obviously the source hasn't been operating recently because of all the business over coronavirus. But it's relatively easy to find current levels of national minimum wage, national living wage on the internet. So I'd refer you to that. I'm not sure that we've got that information. We probably have it somewhere, but I'm not sure. Far easier just to point you towards the general information that's available on those rates.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Here's one from Graham Winston. When we're working out furlough payments, do we have to take into account average earnings or can we base it on a basic 37.5-hour week?
I guess that question might have been asked before we
Yes.
before we kind of answered it. Basically, if somebody's salaried, then you base it on the salary, excluding all those extras that we mentioned. Anybody else, you do it on actual pay. And those three methods that were on the slide earlier, based on how long somebody has been working for you. So, and I have to confess, I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, is in the business that I'm in normally, it's all about what's the basic working week, what's the basic rate, what's the overtime rate, and so on. From our assessment, the guidance that's been given isn't in that space. It is what's the actual earnings, and that will include overtime if the individuals through the reference period. And as I said, each of the calculation methods will tell you what that reference period is. Whatever those earnings were in the reference period, that is the starting point for the grant, which the Inland Revenue will be prepared to make, and as Liz says, therefore the minimum amount that you should be paying in order to qualify for the grant.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We've had a few questions about company directors. You've obviously covered whether or not their salary, etc., is covered, which was helpful. But some of the other questions have been. This one is from John. We have had guidance that a director can do administration work while on furlough. Is this true?
If I answer that, I don't believe it really is true. I think that if a director is working and administration, well, what do we all mean by administration? You know, it's talking to men, it's talking to suppliers. That's what a director does. That is his job. He's working. You can apply for the furlough grant, but you must expect that it may be investigated, it may be refused.
Yeah, I'm just to chip in on that. I was on a CBI webinar, as I've mentioned already earlier today, and this cropped up. And what the lawyers there were saying, I think it was a lawyer from Linklaters, they were saying that the director acting as a director, by which I mean a director for the purposes of the Companies Act, if they're acting within those duties, you know, putting the accounts together and things like that, then that's covered. They can continue doing that. Anything that is out with the sort of narrowly defined duties, obligations under the company's legislation, as Liz says, there's an argument there that that's becoming work. That's not about, you know, the formal duties of a director on under the Companies Acts. That's about work. That's a director, meaning a senior person within the organisation, rather than the director as a legal status that exists under the company's legislation.
If we go back, you know, if you have a scaffolder and he works for an hour in a week, he is not furloughed. If you have a director who works for an hour a week, why should he be treated any differently? That's how the revenue will think about it. It's work. A little bit of work still counts as work.
Thanks, Liz. That's very helpful. A couple of questions I'll put to you now. One is from Hannah Morris. What sort of notice do you have to give to remove furlough? And a second one from David Vaughan. What happens if we offer furlough and they refuse? Do I have to make them redundant?
Andrew, for you.
Yes. Notice to terminate furlough. I don't think. I mean, I'll check on this, but I haven't been asked that question before. So well done. And I'm not sure that there's anything clear on that. I would say, in the absence of any guidance, that might be something that you want to include in your furlough letter. or right subsequently to people. I don't think there's any constraint on you in reality. There's no constraint that I'm aware of. So I would say there's nothing to prevent you from telling somebody on a Friday that you want them to come back on a Monday. But of course, the one qualifier is if the furlough period hasn't lasted 3 weeks, then you will compromise your ability to claim the grant. But other than that, I think that's the only constraint. If somebody refuses to work furlough and you can't accommodate them with work, then yes, I would say that puts them in a redundancy position, because furlough is explicitly an alternative to redundancy. Yes, if somebody won't be accommodated through furlough, then yes, I think you can argue that they are redundant, and you have to proceed on that basis.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. This one's from Mark. Regarding employees who are on a salary sacrifice scheme, is a company allowed to claim 80% of full salary before the sacrifice or after?
It isn't clear in the instructions that have gone out so far, but as I said before, what we're looking at is a grant scheme. You can pay what you like and do what you like. The grant scheme is what you'll get back from the government. And I think that the rules are likely to be that the government will pay you the lower of the amounts. So you will get a grant, I suspect, based on the cash wages you pay, not the cash plus benefits wage. But I'm running on a wing and a prayer there. It isn't in the guidance. It's not discussed. I just think that when you're in offices, counting numbers, trying to work out how your cash flow is going to work, you ought to work on the basis that the grant will be the lower of the amounts. Thank you.
Okay, this one's from Glenn Grant. One company I know has been putting people on layoff instead of furloughing, albeit with the intention of furloughing. What are the risks of doing so?
I suppose to buy time for myself, I'd probably ask Glenn. Hello, Glenn, by the way. I'd probably ask Glenn risks from what point of view. I mean, clearly from an employment point of view, an employment law point of view, if you're laying off, then there are a series of rules around layoff, one of which is you can't lay off unless you've got a contractual clause that permits that, or you reach an agreement with your employees to lay off. Secondly, the risk with there is a payment you make on layoff. The third risk is, and this might be a hypothetical risk, is that after a period of time, under the layoff provisions, the employees can apply for redundancy, which will then crystallize potentially a requirement for the employer to cough up at least a statutory redundancy payment. So, I mean, those are the risks from that point of view. Will it prejudice your ability to claim under the furlough regime? I don't think so. But of course, what it does do is to Liz's point, which is this is a grant scheme. You can only claim for money that you've paid. And if you're operating temporary layoff and paying a minimal amount of money or no amount of money for those people, then it's not money that you can then claim back under the scheme.
Okay, thank you. Just on bank holidays, you did cover it to some extent, but two people have asked, could you just clarify what happens with bank holidays and the furlough? One was Phil Fagg, one was Hannah Morris. Yeah,
I mean, as I said, I've got to preface this by the warning, the health warning, that the business department could issue guidance today which will completely contradict what I'm about to say. But I would say in the bank holidays coming up now, if somebody's on furlough, it shouldn't make a difference. You carry on paying them as if they're on furlough. There is a question mark about whether you should pay them the 80%, the furlough payment, the furlough grant, the equivalent of the furlough grant, or if you should calculate it using the normal holiday pay calculation. And I think to a certain extent, you pays your money and you takes your choice. And I said, as I said, we'll be issuing guidance that will be on the website by Monday. I have to say, the weight of opinion amongst some of these very expensive lawyers who've been sitting at home and debating these things amongst each other, the weight of opinion is you probably apply the holiday pay calculation for the holiday. But you can, of that, of course, you can claim back for that day the equivalent of the 80% under the furlough regime. So it'll probably end up being a sort of top up, but related to the difference between, if you like, the furlough pay, the furlough grant equivalent for that day, and the holiday pay calculation. But as I said, with the health warning, we don't actually know. But that seems to be the balance of advice on that one at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. One from John. If an employee refuses to come to work as they are living with a vulnerable person, are they entitled to be on a furlough contract?
I don't know. I would say nobody is entitled to be on a furlough contract unless the employer furloughs them. Nobody has an entitlement. No individual has an entitlement to furlough. What the guidance describes is those people who can be, at the employer's discretion, put on furlough. So I would say you should exercise your discretion. I'll need to think about that some more, and I will ask the question. My colleagues and I will debate that, and we'll incorporate that into the guidance on Monday. I'm sorry I can't give you an immediate response on that, but I haven't been asked that question before, and I'm struggling to give you an answer which I can tell you 100% you can rely on. So we'll think about that some more and get back to you on that.
Thanks, Andrew. Just take a couple more, then we're going to wrap things up. One from Guy Jones. What if you have a non-working director / shareholder that draws a salary?
Well, as long as they're a non-working director who doesn't work, well, in my own heart, I think, what are they doing to earn a salary, and that it isn't a proper deduction in a set of accounts to pay somebody wages who didn't work? But we all know it does happen. They are entitled to be furloughed because they are not working. It would be possible to claim furlough money for them.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Last one. This is from Jeff. A person employed full-time PAYE with company A joins a different company after serving their normal resignation notice period after 28th of February. A new company, Company B, furloughs its employees, and the new employee is not entitled to be furloughed. Is there any expected change to this, as all new starters between 28th February and furlough will not be paid until they can return to employment or are released?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think not. I think these people fall between two stools.
I do too. That's what I think.
Okay.
Can I? There was one question that I saw about pay as you earn and taxes owed, because everybody is going to continue to run their payrolls of furloughed wages and furloughed employees and will therefore have pay as you earn to pay. If you cannot pay your pay as you earn, you phone in advance to the helplines on the revenue site, and you explain. The pay as you earn can be staged, postponed. That's where the revenue have a lot of scope to bankroll people by not requiring the money to be paid. You do have to run the payrolls. You do have to put in the VAT returns. But when it comes to the debt, you phone and you talk to them, because they have the capacity to postpone debt. Thank you.
Okay, thanks both. We're going to wrap up the webinar there. Rest assured, though, we are looking at all the questions that have come in and anything that we haven't been able to address in full, and we will look to come back to everybody when we can on that. So thanks for listening today. Thanks to our presenters, Andrew Eldred and Liz Bridge. And please do keep an eye on www.eca.co.uk/coronavirus. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday next week. Andrew will be back for that, as will likely our Director of Legal, Rob Driscoll, and we'll have special guest Andy Reacts of the Joint Industry Board. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Keep safe.